Hey everyone, I hope you guys had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year's, and I'm really glad that you guys are back in class, and let's get started with 2015. All right, so let's start off on the right foot by writing our name, as well as our class period, and the date on the top left corner. And it might get some getting used to for writing 2015 after we had a whole year of practice for writing 2014. So today's topic is going to be taxonomy. Now, when we see the word taxonomy, we might think, oh, taxes, that's what we pay for when we're at the grocery store and we have to put those extra 8 cents for every dollar. Or, hey, that's when my parents freak out in April because they're trying to get their tax refund, right? So, taxonomy, instead, when we're talking about in biology, has to do with classification. Now, classification is a topic that we introduced right at the end of spring break, right? Or excuse me, spring break. I'm getting ahead of myself. A topic that we introduced right before Christmas break. So classification, and in biology, of course, we're dealing with living things, also known as organisms. Uh, in class, we might have done this, where we took some pasta that was either a bow tie pasta, or maybe it was like a penne pasta, or maybe it was some macaroni, okay? And we kind of distributed them according to similarities and differences and their like various traits, okay? That was classification, and that's what taxonomy is. All we're doing is we're classifying things, okay? But why classify things in the first place? Well, in our vast world, we have so many different countries, right? And we have scientists that come from each of those countries. And if I were a scientist that was specializing in, I don't know, baboons, okay? And I were to go to a scientist in Africa and we were both studying those baboons, and in our papers we would write about their characteristics, but we didn't really know each other that well. And maybe that scientist spoke Swahili instead of English, okay? And I spoke English. How would we communicate? Well, to do that, what we end up doing is we're communicating in just one language, and that's going to be the language of Latin. That's going to be designated as the scientific language of taxonomy, Latin. And that avoids all that confusion about, you're speaking Swahili, I'm speaking English, right? The second reason that scientists use taxonomy is because we're trying to figure out those evolutionary relationships. Now, evolution is a topic that we introduced right before spring break, right? Again, spring break, I'm getting ahead of myself. Thanksgiving break, a topic that we introduced right before Thanksgiving break. And evolution is a change of population over time, over various generations, right? And remember how we had those cladograms, which were like family trees, and we were trying to figure out, oh, okay, all these vertebrates are going to have vertebrae, they're going to have a backbone, but we see that, for example, sharks, they don't have bony skeletons, so they're more distantly related than other organisms, okay? That's another reason why we use taxonomy. In order to classify organisms, scientists must place them into different levels of classification. And those levels are going to be called taxa. That's why we call it taxonomy, because we're dealing with different taxa. And even though it sounds like a very big, challenging word, it's really not. It's just levels of classification. Just like if you're a freshman or a sophomore, a junior, or senior, those are going to be different levels. Those are going to be different taxa. So there are 8 different levels of classification. And one is going to be super broad and then gets more narrow and more specific. Okay, so the very first one that's super broad, and you might have used it in like computer talk, like internet talk, internet domain. Okay, but this domain is going to be biology related. Some of these words, like domain and like kingdom, you've heard before. Others you might not have heard before, like the word phylum. Again, others you might have seen before, used in different contexts. And then others are going to be new words. Okay, so I said domain is the broadest. So if you're across a river, a really wide river, it would be kind of like that. While species is going to be the most specific. That's why we call it species. And we're going to cross a really narrow river. So it's almost like drawing a little upside down triangle, right? In which we have domain, that's going to be the broadest. It's going to include a whole bunch of living organisms. Phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, those are going to get more and more specific as we go down the taxa. Now I'm going to use red to kind of highlight or overwrite the first letter of each of these taxa. And if you guys have a different color pencil or something like that, I encourage you guys to use it. If not, you could just kind of bold it, okay? Now, I said domain is going to be the largest, while species is going to be the most specific. That's why we call it species, right? A lot of times you might encounter questions asking, oh, which one's going to be more specific, phylum or genus? And you're like, phylum or genus, those are both words that I've never heard before. I'm 14 years old. You're expecting me to know which one's more specific? Yes, I am. But I'm also going to give you guys a little tool, okay? So we just kind of highlighted the first letter of each of those different taxa. And I'm going to rewrite that first letter over here. And I'm going to give you guys a little mnemonic, a little memory trick to help you remember all of this. And it's going to be a question. Did King Philip come over for good soup? I'm going to give you guys a moment to write this down. Did King Philip come over for good soup? Now, if you could remember this sentence, you could remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, because you could just say the sentence and you could rewrite that those first few letters anywhere on your piece of paper, and you're going to be remembering, oh, phylum, okay, so that's actually more broad than our genus, because genus is going to be a lot more specific, or class is going to be more broad than order. Okay, super important little trick that you guys can remember. All right, so let's go ahead and scroll down. So each living organism is placed into each taxa: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, or King Philip came over for good soup. They didn't include domain in there, but you could just change it, right? So this is going to be according to the similarities or characteristics. They share with each organism in the taxa. For example, organisms in the same order are going to all share the same characteristic that are special to that order. Because the levels of classification are ordered from most broad or general to most specific until we get all the way to species, right? Two organisms in the same kingdom are, and I want you to scratch out this the right here and this the right here, because afterwards it doesn't make a lot of grammatical sense. So we're going from the most broad or general to the most specific. Two organisms that are in the same kingdom. Did King Philip? Oh, king. Okay, so that's going to be one of the first ones, so that's pretty broad. So they're going to be somewhat similar. So for example, if we're in the plant kingdom, you have a giant tree and you have a tiny blade of grass. They both photosynthesize. They both take in carbon dioxide, sunlight, and they're actually able to make oxygen gas for us to breathe. They're actually able to make sugar and food and glucose, right? And they're actually able to make water out of that, okay? So because of that, what we're going to do is we're going to put them in the same kingdom. But again, we have this giant tall tree and this little blade of grass. Okay, so they're somewhat similar. When we're talking about genus, did King Philip come over for good soup? Good. Oh, that's towards the end. These are going to be very similar to each other. Okay. So that's what that little trick really comes in handy. All right, scientific names. Each organism is also given a scientific name based on their classification. The scientific name for an organism is always comprised of its genus name and its species name. It's almost like a surname and a first name, right? So for example, my name is Francis T, right? T is going to be my family name. Francis is specific for me, even though I usually go by my middle name, Michael. Okay, so that's kind of the system we're going to use here. So for us, instead of writing genus with a lowercase g, we're actually going to capitalize it because that's kind of like our surname. It's the broader category. It contains more organisms, right? While species is going to be even more specific, and we're going to lowercase that. All right, so let's do an example. You and I, we're both human, okay? So in English, we write human. In Italian, it would be uomo. In Spanish, I believe it's hombres, right? Again, to avoid all that confusion, we're going to stick with Latin, okay? So let's write out our scientific name in Latin. So after all of that, we have Homo sapien. Homo sapien. Now, you notice here that the H is capitalized. That's because it's going to be the genus. While the S is not capitalized, that's going to be the species. And the meaning of our name just means man that is wise. Okay? So homo is going to be in Latin man, and sapien means wise in Latin. So we are wise men. Kind of a very pretentious or very flattering name for ourselves, right? For our own species name. So again, genus is going to be here. It's going to be capitalized, while species is going to be the second name in our scientific name, and that's going to be lowercase. Now we're going to move on to the six kingdoms. Now the six kingdoms is super important, and in fact it's so important that I'm going to give it 2 red stars, and that I'm actually going to dedicate a whole nother video to this. Okay, so again, we just went over the basics of taxonomy. Now we're going to go over kingdoms in our next video.